cold stone, bare feet, a clay pot heavier than the girl who carried it. Every dawn she climbed the hill for water while the house still slept, her shoulders raw, her stomach hollow, a beating waiting at the top. If she let one drop spill, they called her Ebele, and she believed she was no one. Yet the truth her own heart could not reach was this: 3 rivers away, a king grieves each season for the daughter a flood tore from his arms, and the lost child still breathes, hauling another woman's load, swallowing another woman's cruelty. The woman who beat her, the stepmother who fed her last and worked her first, was about to sell her to the palace for a fistful of silver, glad to be rid of the burden. On the day Ebele knelt to serve in the great hall, her wrapper slipped from one shoulder, and the king saw it. A dark crescent, the moon of the royal women, born into her skin and impossible to fake. Silence. The cup slipped from his hand and struck the floor. So who is this barefoot girl, truly, and who buried a living princess inside a stranger's cold kitchen? Before this fire burns tall, tell me one small thing. Where in the wide world are you listening from tonight? Drop your city down below, and let us begin. But to understand why a king's cup would fall and shatter at the sight of one girl's shoulder, you must travel back 3 rivers and 18 long years, to the kingdom of Umunri, where the water gives life and the water takes it. Umunri sat in the bend of a great river the people called the Mother. She fed their yams and filled their nets. And in the season of high rain, she rose like a thing with a temper, brown and roaring, dragging trees and goats and unlucky men into her belly. The kingdom honored her with a rite each year: drums at the bank, a white ram, old prayers carried downstream on woven rafts of palm. For as long as the elders could remember, the river had been both their mother and their grave. Their king was Eze Obiora, a broad man with a voice that once filled the council hall like a storm fills a valley. In his strong years he was famous for 2 things: his fairness and his laughter. He judged a poor man's case with the same patience he gave a chief's, and when he laughed, the whole court breathed easier. That laughter had been gone a long time. The people no longer spoke of why, not above a whisper, because grief that deep becomes a kind of sacred ground that the tongue learns to step around. The story lived only in the old ones now. They remembered a queen named Neka, tall, dark, quick to smile, who carried on her own shoulder the dark crescent that marked the royal women, the moon-shaped sign passed down mother to daughter since the founding of the line. They remembered the night she gave the king a child, a girl, and how the whole kingdom danced because the line would not break. And they remembered the flood. It came in the worst rains anyone had lived through. The mother rose past her banks in a single night, swallowed the lower town, and reached her brown fingers toward the palace gate itself. The queen was carried to high ground with her infant wrapped against her chest. Somewhere in the dark, in the screaming and the water and the breaking of small boats, both of them were torn away. By dawn the river had pulled back sullen and full. They found the queen 3 days later far downstream and laid her in the royal ground with the rites of a beloved mother. The child they never found at all. No body, no wrapper, no small soft thing washed up among the reeds. The diviners said the river had claimed her whole, and a king cannot argue with the mother. So Eze Obiora buried an empty space beside his wife and called it his daughter, and something in him went quiet that never woke again. Each year when the rains came and the drums called the people to the bank, the king walked to the water alone. He would stand where the flood had taken her, an old man now, his beard gone the color of ash, and he would say a name no one else was permitted to speak aloud. Some seasons he wept. Most seasons he only stood, watching the brown current move, as if waiting for it to give back what it owed him. The throne sat heavy behind him. A king with no heir is a roof with no center post, and the kingdom knew it. The chiefs murmured. The nephew waited, and the dark crescent moon, the one true mark of the royal blood, the sign no goldsmith could forge and no liar could claim, lived now only in an old man's memory and in the cold ground where his queen slept. So, when the elders tell this story by the fire, they always pause here. Because the river, they say, is a thief with a strange conscience. She takes what she wants. But sometimes, after many years, when no one is watching and no one still hopes, she sets it gently back on the shore and waits to see who will be brave enough to notice. Far downstream, in a cruel woman's compound, a barefoot girl was about to be noticed. That cruel woman's compound stood at the edge of a fishing village called Aqua, far downriver from the palace, where the mother ran wide and slow, and the houses smelled of smoke and drying nets. Here Ebele had lived her whole life, and here, until 2 rains ago, she had been loved. The man who raised her was a fisherman named Emeka, gentle, weathered, his hands cracked from rope and salt. 18 years back, in the season after the Great Flood, he had gone out at first light and found something tangled in the reeds far from any village. A baby, half drowned, wrapped in a fine indigo cloth no fisherman's wife would ever own. He looked for who had lost her. No one came. So he carried her home, named her Ebele for the mercy that had spared her small life, and raised her as his own blood. He kept the indigo cloth folded in a wooden box, the way a poor man keeps the one beautiful thing the river ever gave him. Then the fever took him. Into the empty house he left behind came Ifua, a widow from the next village, with 2 grown daughters and a smile that never reached her eyes. She married into the home, and within a season she ruled it. The daughters slept till the sun was high. Ebele rose in the dark. Picture her day, and you will know her heart. She fetched the water and lit the fire, and pounded the yam before the others stirred. She ate what was left, which was often nothing. When a pot cracked, the blame was hers. When a coin went missing, the slap was hers. Ifua had a particular cruelty. She never raised her voice. She simply spoke, soft and cold, telling the girl she was ugly, that she was useless, that the only reason a roof still covered her head was Ifua's wasted kindness. Words like that dripped daily, wear a person down the way slow water wears a stone. But the river had not pulled Ebele from death to make her hard. She stayed gentle in a house with no gentleness in it. She sang under her breath to the cooking fire. She saved scraps for the lame dog the others kicked. And when her wrapper grew thin, she wore it thin and never once complained. Because somewhere inside her lived the memory of a man who had loved her for nothing in return. Now let me pause here, because this next moment is the whole reason I am telling you this story. And if you believe a kind heart should be rewarded and a cruel one should answer for what it did, then subscribe right now so the river can carry you the rest of this tale. Done? Good. Lean in one market morning, an old beggar woman came to the compound gate. She was half blind, her feet bound in rags, her bowl empty. The daughters laughed at her. Ifua drove her off with a stick and a curse, calling her a bringer of bad luck. The old woman stumbled back into the road and sat in the dust, too tired to weep. Ebele watched from the doorway, with her own meager bowl of food in her hands. The only thing she would eat that whole day. She crossed the yard. She knelt in the dust beside the stranger, and she gave the old woman everything in the bowl, and then she unwound the worn wrapper from her own shoulders and laid it over the woman's shaking ones, leaving herself in little more than rags under the climbing sun. "Why," the old woman whispered, gripping her hand, "you have nothing. I have a little," Ebele said softly, "and you have less." The old woman went very still. Her clouded eyes searched the girl's face for a long moment, as if she were reading something written there long ago, something she half remembered. Then she pressed Ebeli's fingers, murmured a blessing too quiet to hear, and shuffled away down the road. Ebeli thought nothing more of it. To her it was a crumb of bread and a scrap of cloth. She did not know she had just shown mercy to the one living soul in all the world who could prove who she truly was. And she did not know that, 3 rivers away, the price of her had already been agreed. The price of her was 3 silver coins and a length of cheap printed cloth. Afua haggled for it the way she haggled for fish, in the cool of her own doorway, with a palace steward who had come down river buying servants for the season of the great rite. The kingdom needed hands, girls to fetch and pour and kneel through the long days of drumming and feasting at the mother's bank. Afua looked at Ebeli the way a trader looks at a goat, and named her cheap, and was glad. By the time the sun stood high, it was done. No goodbye, no blessing, only a shove toward the steward's cart and a last cold word, that the palace would soon learn what a useless creature it had bought. Ebeli climbed into the cart with the wooden box clutched against her chest, the box that held Emika's old indigo cloth, the only thing in this world that was truly hers. She did not look back at the house. There was nothing in it to miss. For 3 days the cart followed the river upstream, and with every mile the mother changed. She narrowed. She quickened. The flat fishing flats gave way to high green banks, and then on the 3rd evening the land opened, and there it was, Umunri, the royal town, its walls red with the setting sun, its great drums already speaking across the water for the coming rite. Ebeli had never seen anything so large in her life. Torches. Walls. A crowd that moved like a single living thing. She was herded with the other bought girls through a side gate into the smoke and clatter of the palace kitchens, and there she was put to work before she had even caught her breath. She worked the way she always had, head down, hands quick, asking for nothing. The other servants paid her no mind. To them she was one more thin girl from one more poor village, here for the season and gone after. None of them looked twice at the dark mark on her shoulder, half hidden under her wrapper, because servants are taught to keep their eyes on the floor. On the 3rd day of the festival, they sent her into the great hall. The hall was a sea of light, 100 lamps, just the chiefs in heavy cloth, their gold catching fire in the glow, and at the far end, raised on the leopard dais, the old king himself, Obiora, ash-bearded, sad-eyed, watching his people feast without truly seeing them. Ebeli was handed a heavy clay pot of palm wine and told to keep the chief's cups full and to be invisible while she did it. She moved along the low tables, pouring, kneeling, rising, pouring again, careful as ever not to spill a single drop. She did not notice the king. The king did not notice her. She was one moving shadow among 100 in a hall full of greater things. Then she knelt to fill the cup of the chief nearest the dais. As she bent, the pot heavy in both her arms, her thin wrapper slid from her shoulder and fell loose to her elbow. And there, bared full in the lamplight for any eye to see, was the dark crescent moon set into her skin. The king saw it. He had been lifting his own cup toward his lips. His hand stopped in the air. Across the whole bright, noisy length of that hall, the old man's eyes locked onto one small servant girl's shoulder, and the color drained from his face like water from a cracked pot. He knew that mark. He had kissed it on a baby's skin 18 rains ago. He had wept over it on the cold shoulder of the wife they pulled from the flood. The drums played on. The chiefs laughed and ate. The whole hall roared with light and life, and not one soul in it understood that the world had just stopped turning. Time stopped, and in the loud golden hall, an old king began, very slowly, to rise from his throne. An old king does not rise quickly. Yet when Obiora came to his feet on the leopard dais, Something in the way he moved made the nearest chiefs turn, and then the ones behind them, until the laughter at the high tables thinned and died, and a strange hush rolled outward through the hall like a ripple across still water. He came down from the dais, the king of Umunri, who had not crossed his own hall on foot for any man in years, walked between the long tables toward a serving girl, and the crowd parted before him without understanding why. Eboli felt the room change before she saw the cause. The pouring stopped. The talking stopped. She lifted her head, and there, close enough to touch, stood the old king himself, staring at her bare shoulder with eyes full of something she had no name for. Terror seized her. She dropped to her knees and pressed her face toward the floor, certain she had broken some law she did not know, certain the next thing would be the lash. "Don't move," he said. His voice shook. "Child, do not move." The whole hall held its breath. He knelt. The king knelt, there on the floor of his own court, before a barefoot girl bought for 3 coins, and with a hand that trembled like a leaf in wind, he drew the thin wrapper gently from her shoulder. The mark sat full in the lamplight, a dark crescent, clean-edged, curved like the new moon, not painted, not scarred, but grown into the skin, the way a birthmark is grown and never made. A sound left the king that was half word and half sob. He pressed his old fingers to the floor to keep from falling. When he found his voice, it came out cracked and low, and it carried to every corner of that silent hall. "This is the mark of the royal women," he said. "This is the moon of my mother and my mother's mother. This is the sign my wife carried." He raised his wet eyes to the girl's frightened face, and the only other living soul who ever bore it was the daughter the river took from me. The hall did not breathe. The drums had long since stopped. Chiefs stared, mouths open, at the old man weeping on his knees before a kitchen girl. Some thought their king had finally been broken by grief. Some leaned close, squinting at the dark crescent, and felt the cold finger of something they could not yet believe. Ebel understood none of it. She only knew the king of all the land was kneeling in front of her, calling her shoulder by names she had never heard, and that the world she thought she understood had cracked open like an egg. But not every face in that hall was wet with wonder. To the right of the dais, half in shadow, stood a tall young man in fine cloth, Kelechi, the king's nephew, the man the chiefs had quietly come to call the heir. For 18 years he had stood close to that empty throne. He had learned its weight, measured its reach, told himself in the dark that it would one day be his by right, because there was no one else left to take it. He watched his uncle kneel. He watched the old man weep over a mark on a servant's skin, and in the space of 3 slow breaths, Kelechi understood everything the chiefs had not yet grasped, that if the crescent was real, if this girl was who the king's tears already named her, then the throne he had spent half his life waiting for had just walked into the hall on a beggar's bare feet. His face showed nothing. He had learned long ago to keep his face a still pool with the whole storm hidden underneath. He even bowed his head, as a loyal nephew should, and let one slow tear of his own slide down for the watching crowd to admire. But behind that bowed head, a cold and careful mind had already begun to work, and by the time he lifted it again, Kelechi was no longer grieving a lost cousin. He was hunting a rival. By the time the king lifted the girl from the floor, with his own hands, the rite at the river was forgotten. The festival could wait. The drums could wait. Eze Obiora swept Ebele from the great hall to his private chambers, summoned the keepers of the royal memory, and gave one trembling command, that the truth of this mark be tested tonight before he let himself hope and break his old heart a second time. They came in the deep of night, the ones who guard what a kingdom must never forget. First the royal historian, an ancient man named Dim, whose head held the bloodline of the throne back 9 generations the way another man holds his own name. Then the eldest of the eldest, the council mothers and the keepers of the shrine, women whose word on matters of blood and birth no chief in Umunri would dare to question. They gathered close around the frightened girl in the lamplight, and one by one they studied the dark crescent on her shoulder. Old Dim looked the longest. He set his lined thumb beside the mark, not touching, only measuring with his eyes, the curve of it, the clean dark edge, the way the skin around it lay smooth and undisturbed. "This was not put here," he said at last, very quietly. "Dye fades and rubs. A scar leaves its anger in the flesh around it. This is neither. This grew where it sits, the day she drew her first breath." He straightened, and his old voice steadied into something close to awe. "I have seen this moon twice in my life. Once on the shoulder of Queen Neneka. Once on the shoulder of the infant we lost to the flood. I never thought these eyes would see it a third time." The council mothers murmured the old words and pressed their palms to their hearts. One of them began, softly, to weep. Belief, though, was not moving every heart in the palace. Word of the kneeling king had run through Umunri before dawn, the way fire runs through dry grass, and by morning Kelechi had heard every version of it. He did not rage, he did not pace. He sat alone in the cool of his own compound and let the cold, careful part of him do its work, because a man who has waited 18 years for a throne does not surrender it to a kitchen girl's shoulder without a fight. By the time the council gathered in full daylight, Kelechi was ready, and he wore the face of a worried, loyal nephew. He did not attack the girl. That was his cunning. He praised the king's tender heart instead, and grieved, aloud, that such a heart might be so easily deceived. "My uncle has wept for this child for 18 years, he told the assembled chiefs, his voice warm and sorrowful. "His grief is known to every soul in this kingdom, and to every trickster in it too. How simple a thing, for a clever girl and a greedy mistress, to learn the one mark that would open a king's arms. A little dye, a whispered story. An old man so hungry to believe that he kneels before the first shoulder that fits the tale." The chiefs shifted. Some had already half thought it. Kelechi let the doubt settle, then planted it deeper. He reminded them gently of all he had carried for the throne through the long, empty years. He reminded them that a kingdom mocked is a kingdom made weak, and that the neighboring lands would laugh to hear that Umunri had crowned a fisherman's servant on the strength of a smudge. He never once raised his voice. He simply spoke, soft and cold, and any servant from a certain downriver village would have shivered to hear how exactly his quiet cruelty matched another's. By the end of it, the council was split clean down the middle. Half had seen the old historian's awe and believed. Half had heard the nephew's reason and doubted, so the elders ruled the only way they could. The mark, they declared, was a sign, but a sign was not enough to seat a soul upon the leopard throne. They would need more. They would need a living witness who had touched the lost child with their own hands, and they would need proof of the very night the river stole her. 2 things, then, stood between Ebele and her name. And Kelechi, listening from his seat, smiled inside, because he knew exactly where both of those things were, and he meant to reach them first. Kelechi knew where both things were, because Kelechi had spent 18 years learning everything the throne touched. The witness was no mystery to a man who had studied the old story from every angle. On the night of the flood, only one pair of hands besides the queen's had held the royal infant, the hands of the palace midwife who had caught the child at her birth and washed her clean, and seen the dark crescent rise on the new skin. Her name was Ada. After the flood, when grief turned the palace cold and someone had to be blamed for a child no one could save, She had been quietly dismissed, sent away with nothing, and forgotten. 18 years of nothing had worn her down to a half-blind beggar, wandering the river villages with an empty bowl. That same beggar was the one a barefoot girl had once knelt beside in the dust and covered with her own wrapper. Neither of them had known. To Eboli it was a stranger and a crumb of bread. To Ada, clouded eyes searching a young face, it had been a ghost, the queen's own features looking back at her, out of a servant girl's skin. But she had told herself she was an old woman dreaming, and shuffled away, and said nothing. Now the woman who alone could swear to the mark was somewhere out on the downriver roads, and she did not yet know that the child she'd half recognized was about to need her more than breath. The second proof slept in a wooden box. Inside it lay the indigo cloth, the fine, deep-dyed wrapper a poor fisherman had found, knotted around a half-drowned baby, and kept all these years because it was too beautiful to be a fisherman's. Belly had carried that box into the palace, clutched to her chest, never once guessing that the cloth inside bore, woven into its border in thread of pale gold, the royal bird of Umunri, the mark no common weaver was permitted to make, the mark that said a queen's hands had wrapped this child. The king did not know to look for it. The council did not know it existed. But Kelechi, turning the old story over and over in the dark, had remembered a detail everyone else had let go, that the lost princess had been carried from the palace, wrapped in her mother's own cloth, and that cloth had never been found. If the witness and the wrapper ever came together before the council, the girl's name was sealed. So, Kelechi moved to make sure they never would. He sent men he trusted downriver that same night, with silver and quiet instructions. Find the old midwife first. A beggar leaves a trail of villages behind her, and a few coins loosen any tongue. When you find her, do not harm her. A dead witness raises questions. Simply move her. Take her somewhere far, somewhere the council's runners will never think to look, and keep her there until the king grows tired of hoping, and the kitchen girl is sent back to her pots. Then he turned his mind to the cloth. He could not search the king's own chambers without rousing suspicion, so he was patient. He learned that the servant girl had come with a small wooden box, and that the box had been carried to a storeroom with the other bought girl's poor belongings. That night, while the palace slept off the broken festival, two figures slipped into that storeroom by lamplight and began quietly to lift the lids of every box. Far away, on a dark road between two villages, Kelechi's first set of men were closing on a bent old shape limping through the moonlight with an empty bowl and a worn wrapper around her shoulders. And in the palace, the searching hands found the right box at last. They lifted the lid. Inside lay folded cloth, deep indigo even in the weak light, and a corner of it caught the lamp and gave back the faintest gleam of gold thread. A hand reached down to take it, but somewhere above a floorboard creaked, and a voice in the dark said, "Who's there?" The hand froze over the box, and three rivers of fate that had run apart for 18 years began that very night to race toward the same shore. "Who's there?" the voice called again, and a watchman's lamp swung toward the storeroom door. The two figures dropped the lid and slipped out the far side into the dark, empty-handed. The cloth was safe for tonight. But Kelechi had never staked everything on a single box in the dark. The cloth was only one road to the throne, and while his men crept and failed, he was already walking a far more dangerous one. He went to the king's brother. Ozo was the old king's younger brother, and the head of the ruling council, a proud, hard man who loved Umunri the way a soldier loves a flag, and who feared, above all things, to see his family made a fool of before the people. Kelechi knew that fear like he knew his own hand. He did not lie to Ozo. He did something cleverer. He told him only true things, arranged in a shape that pointed straight at a lie. "Your brother is not himself," Kelechi said, soft and grave. "He weeps. He kneels on the floor of his own hall. He has pulled a kitchen girl from the cooking fires and seated her near the throne, and the whole kingdom is talking. Our enemies are talking. They say the great Umunri will crown a servant on the strength of a stain, because a grieving old man cannot tell hope from truth. Every word of it was true. That was the poison." Ozo's face darkened with each sentence. He loved his brother, but he had watched grief eat that brother for 18 years. And a part of him had long believed the old king's mind was no longer to be trusted on the one wound that had never healed. Now here was that wound, walking the palace on a beggar's feet, with the chiefs whispering and the neighboring lands beginning to laugh. By morning, Ozo had made up his mind. He went to the council, not as a brother, but as its head, and he ruled with the full weight of his office. The girl was an unproven claim and a growing shame, and unless true proof stood before the council by the next sunset, she would be put out of the palace gate at dawn, and the matter closed forever. The king begged. His own brother would not bend, and so the truth, which had been so close, began to slide backward toward the dark. A witness lost on a far road, a cloth they did not know to claim, a sunset deadline, and the most powerful man in the council now turned against the frightened girl. Then, an hour before that final sunset, a commotion rose at the palace gate. A bent old shape was pushing through the guards, clutching a worn and faded wrapper, crying out a name no beggar should know. A name no beggar should know rang across the courtyard. "Adaisi, the child is Adaisi," and the guards fell back, because the old woman pushing through them was calling the dead princess by the name only the royal house had ever spoken aloud. They brought her before the council in the failing light, an hour before the sunset that was meant to end everything. The hall filled fast, the king on his dais, leaning forward, Ozo at the council's head, hard-faced and certain, Kelechi in his place near the throne, the picture of calm, though anyone watching closely might have seen one muscle tighten in his jaw when the old woman raised her clouded eyes and he saw, for the first time, exactly who the witness was. It was Ada, the midwife he had sent his men to bury in some far village. His men had searched the downriver roads for a beggar with a bowl, and never once thought to look on the road that led straight to the palace, because they could not imagine the witness would walk toward danger instead of away from it. But Ada had heard in a riverside market the impossible rumor of a servant girl and a royal mark. She had remembered a young face in the dust and a wrapper laid across her shoulders and a ghost of the dead queen looking out of a stranger's eyes, and she had turned half-blind and barefoot, and walked 3 days toward the only palace she had ever served. "Speak," said the king, and his voice shook. "Tell them what these hands have held." The old woman stood in the center of that great hall, and laid the night of the flood bare, piece by piece, the way you lay out the bones of a thing until no one can deny its shape. She had caught the king's daughter at her birth. She had washed out the child clean with her own hands. She had seen the dark crescent rise on the new skin below the left shoulder. Not the right, the left, and she named the side before anyone showed her the girl, so that no one in that hall could say she'd been coached. She told them of the cloth the queen had chosen herself, deep indigo. The royal bird worked into the border in pale gold thread, woven for a princess and wrapped around the baby the very night the river came. Then old Dim, the historian, rose, and the timeline locked shut like a door. The flood, he reminded them, had come on the third night of the high rains, 18 years past. Downriver, in the season that followed, a fisherman named Emeka had pulled a half-drowned infant from the reeds, wrapped in fine indigo cloth no fisherman's wife could own, and raised her as Ebeli. The dates met. The river's own current ran from the palace straight down past Emeka's village. A queen's child lost in the water above, a baby in a queen's cloth found in the water below, the same season, the same river. One child, one truth, bring the cloth, the king commanded. They brought the wooden box from the storeroom, the box Kelechi's men had failed to empty, and lifted out the folded indigo wrapper and held it up in the lamplight. The royal bird gleamed in pale gold along its border. The council mothers gasped. Ozo, the hard man who had ruled against her, rose slowly from his seat and could not take his eyes from the thread. Mark on her shoulder. Cloth from the box. Witness who knew the side before she saw it. The very night, the very river, the very season. All of it meeting in one girl kneeling on the floor. Every face in that hall turned as one toward Kelechi. He stood, he tried. He reached for the smooth, cold reason that had served him so well, and he opened his mouth to speak of die and tricks and grieving old men. But the words had nowhere to stand. The mark was born, not made, the historian had sworn it. The witness had named the side unprompted. The cloth bore a bird no common hand could weave. The dates ran together like two streams into one. Every road he might have lied down was already closed, and he knew it. And worse, every chief in that hall could see that he knew it. Silence. Kelechi, who had waited 18 years for a throne, stood in the center of the court with his mouth open and his reasons gone. He had nothing, and into that silence, the old king came down from his dais a second time, not weeping now, but trembling with something far greater, and reached out his hands toward the barefoot girl the whole kingdom had finally, truly seen. His hands closed around hers, and the old king raised the barefoot girl to her feet before the whole court. Yet even a king's love is not enough to seat a soul upon the leopard throne. One thing remained. The ancestors themselves had to be asked. They held the right at first light, at the river's edge, where the mother runs past the palace, and where 18 reigns before, she had stolen everything. The whole kingdom came. The shrine keepers wrapped the girl in the indigo cloth her own mother had chosen, the royal bird gleaming gold against her shoulder. The eldest of the council mothers poured the libation onto the wet earth and called the names of the queens who had gone before, back and back, mother to daughter, all the way to the founding of the line, and asked the ancestors in the old tongue to look upon this child and say whether the blood was true. A hush fell over the bank. Even the drums waited. Then the old priestess turned the girl gently and bared the dark crescent to the rising sun, beside the same moon worked into the cloth by a dead queen's hands. And she lifted her voice so the whole kingdom heard it carry across the water. "The river took a daughter of this house," she cried. "The river has returned her. Adaeze, child of Neka, daughter of Obiora. The ancestors know their own." And the people roared like the flood itself, but this time in joy. Adaeze. She had a name now, a true one, and a father weeping openly beside her, and a kingdom on its knees before her in the wet morning light. So what did she do? In the moment the whole world finally bowed, she knelt, before they could place a single ornament of royalty upon her. The new princess went down into the river mud, in her fine cloth, and bowed her head, first toward the downriver village where a poor fisherman lay buried, the man who had asked the water no questions and raised a stranger's child as his own. "My father found me," she said softly, and no one mistook which father she meant. Then she rose, crossed to the bent old midwife standing forgotten at the edge of the crowd, took both of Ada's trembling hands in hers, and lifted the woman who had once begged in the dust to stand beside her in a place of honor. The crowd wept to see it. They had waited for a princess. What the river gave them back was something rarer, a great heart that power had not spoiled and grief had not hardened. And the king, watching his daughter raise a beggar to her side, turned at last, slowly, toward the men who had tried to bury her. He turned toward the men who had tried to bury her, and the joy on the riverbank cooled into something graver. Justice in Umunri was not cruelty. It was balance, the old exact weighing that gives each person back the shape of what they did. Kelechi was brought before the council he had poisoned. The king did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Every chief had watched the lie die in the nephew's mouth. Eze Obiora stripped him of his title, his place near the throne, and the name of prince he had worn for 18 empty years. The seat he had schemed and lied and nearly killed to keep was given, in the end, to the very girl he had tried to drown in doubt. And Kelechi was sent to live out his days in a small house by the river's edge, beside the same mother he had tried to use as a weapon against her, listening to her run day after day, carrying nothing back to him but the sound of all he had lost. Word of the fallen princess reached Aqua, of course, and greed, as it always does, came running. Ifua arrived at the palace gate in her finest cloth, beaming, sure her fortune had finally turned. She had come, she announced, to be honored, for had she not raised the lost princess as her own loving daughter? Had she not fed her, sheltered her, guided her to the very palace where her destiny waited? The court let her talk. Then they brought in the steward, who had counted 3 silver coins into her hand, and Mama Ada, who had felt that same hand drive her from the gate with a stick. Ifua's smile died slowly. She was not beaten. She was not jailed. The princess would not stain her first days with blood. Ifua was simply stripped of the home she had stolen, given back nothing, and turned out through the gate onto the long road, barefoot, with no blessing and no coin, to walk the same cold miles she had once forced upon a motherless girl. The road that breaks a kind heart only tempers it. The same road, walked by a cruel one, becomes its judgment. And the kingdom, for the first time in 18 years, breathed. The seasons turned, as seasons do, and the kingdom that had wept for 18 years learned how to celebrate again. Princess Adis grew into her name. She ruled beside her aging father, and where his grief had once made the throne a cold and distant thing, her mercy made it a place the smallest person in Umunri could approach without fear. She judged the poor woman's case with the same patience she gave the chief's, just as her father once had, in his strong years, before the river broke him. The old laughter came back to the palace. It came back through her. She did not forget the road she had walked. By her hand a house was raised near the gate for orphans and widows and the cast-out, the people the world feeds last and works first. And no traveler was ever again driven from that gate with a stick. She gave shoes to the barefoot because she remembered cold stone under her own young feet. And Mama Ada, who had once begged in the dust, lived out her days in a place of honor by the princess's side, her clouded eyes finally at rest. Her mother's indigo cloth was hung in the shrine, where it remains to this day, so the story would never again be lost. The elders by the fire will tell you the meaning of it, the way the old ones always do. The river may carry the child far from home, but the blood, they say, always finds its way back to the shore. Cruelty buries the truth in a shallow grave. Time and a kind heart dig it up again, and the kindness Adis showed a stranger in the dust did not stop with her. It rippled outward, to the orphans she sheltered, who grew and sheltered others, until half the kingdom could trace its mercy back to one barefoot girl who gave away her only bowl of food on the worst day of her life. Now, before you leave this fire tonight, carry one question with you. In this whole story, what was it that truly saved her? The royal blood she was born with, or the kind heart she chose every single day? Tell me below. I am reading every answer, and if this tale moved something in you, let the next one find you. Follow now, and I will meet you at the fire again.